John's Gospel is one of the most beloved books in the whole Bible. It's been the cherished book of many readers. It was especially beloved by many of the Romantics, which I'm sure you're not surprised to learn. Coleridge would read it all at once on his knees in preparation to take communion, which he did not do often. And Wordsworth read it over and over again. It was kind of the book of the Bible he always returned to. I think it's partly because of the visionary aspect of the gospel. And I'll be talking a little bit about that. The feature that this gospel um, highlights, the feature that this lecture highlights is that the Gospel of John enacts spiritual growth and facilitates kind of visionary outlook. Through the misunderstanding motif, as we'll see, it's constantly making this function of the mind to look from the literal to the figurative. And it exercises that. And its narrative aims at exercising that, I think, the visionary capacity, the ability to read the world in terms of a underlying and greater spiritual reality. And most of the texts on our syllabus do that in different ways. So in the syllabus, I defined visionary as a heightened perception to the interdependent spiritual, sometimes mystical aspects of life and nature. And the visionary tradition in literature is one that imagines and communicates this awareness, this sensitivity to the spiritual or divine reality that moves beneath the surface of our existence. And so, how the gospel does this is the main idea of the lecture. We're going to focus mostly on the literary forms, the literary features, its narrative patterns, its use of specific words, its images, and its metaphors. And I'll also consider what the gospel implies about nature and where the visionary poetics come into play. Just as Plato's allegory offers an interpretation on the unexamined life and asks us to interpret our own limited knowledge in terms of some greater, brighter reality, so the Gospel of John asks its readers to change how they read the world. And this narrative consists of interpretive leaps from the literal to the figurative, from the typological fixture to the fulfillment or the antitype. We learned a little bit about this in our lecture at noon today from the Bible and poetry course, from the physical to the spiritual. Let me give you a little background on the Gospel of John. The Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew, in the case of some prophets, biblical Aramaic, but mostly in Hebrew. And the New Testament was written in Koine Greek, which was the language of the marketplace, the language of the people. And so the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. There are four Gospels, and these are the first four books of the New Testament. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first three are what's called Synoptic Gospels, and they are similar in structure and theological emphasis. They're called synoptic because sign means together. Opsis is the sight or the vision, so they're seen from the same perspective oftentimes. There are different inflections in the three synoptic gospels, but for the most part, they present a similar structure, a similar sequence of events, often using the same or identical wording, and they suggest the literary interdependence. Like the authors were doing different things, but they knew each other. The synoptics follow the chronological narrative of Jesus' ministry, beginning with his baptism and culminating in his crucifixion and resurrection. John is a little bit different. John, many scholars, theologians, church history has seen this book to be written by John, the disciple, the son of Zebedee, and not John the Baptist, although he's figured there. But this is John, the son of Zebedee, who's also called the beloved disciple. And we think that that's a self-reference to the writer. The person who's writing it down seems to be different from the narrator who is giving these stories, it sounds like, to a scribe. So that's some of the context there. But it's different. John's gospel is different from the first four, the synoptic gospels, because it opens with a cosmic prologue. It presents Jesus as the pre-existent Logos. This is in John chapter 1. And this theological framing shifts the focus from a documentary account to more of a reflection on Jesus' divine nature. The synoptic gospels, it's a lot like journalism, the way it's read. Unlike the synoptics, which focus on Jesus' parables and exorcisms, John does not have parables. The Jesus of John's gospel speaks instead with discourse. There are a lot of conversations in the Gospel of John, and not many sermons. Although there are sermons where Jesus, like in the Synoptic Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount, in the book of Matthew, 6 to 8, he's speaking, and there's not much back and forth. But in the Gospel of John, you have a dialogue, and there are no exorcisms in John. Instead, there are miracles that function as signs that point to Jesus' identity. A little bit more about the discourses, because I think what John is doing is he's writing for a Hellenistic audience, for Greeks who knew Plato, even. And we saw how Plato wanted to write the Socratic dialogues as dialogues to show how the people with whom Socrates is speaking agree at different points, different checkpoints with the assent of the will, say, oh yes, I agree, Socrates. And, it kind of has this give and take. John's doing the same thing in a lot of Jesus's conversations. I think that's significant. Hello, everyone. If you're enjoying this lecture and you'd like to join the live classrooms and the discussions, then you can sign up to study literature with me at Versed, an online community where readers study poetry and take classes together. It's inspired by the university lecture hall and discussion model, and this is where I host my live courses, my live lectures, book clubs, seminar discussions, and more, all with an open door policy. No pressure, no cold calls, and no snobbery. Just serious people who love literature in a friendly space. Every few months or so, we vote on our next courses and reading groups, so as a member, you can help us decide what we'll read next. And when you do join, you'll get access to the live discussions that are happening now, all the past courses, all the discussion rooms, the chat rooms, the special Q&A sessions that I sometimes host, and the office hours with me, where you can talk about your latest readings. You'll even find space to share some of your own poetry if you're a poet yourself, a place where you can workshop poetry with other poets who practice the craft. It's a great place to find community with other readers and other poets. So if you'd like to join us, check out the link below. And now, back to the lecture. So the synoptics primarily present Jesus' ministry in Galilee as a single journey to Jerusalem. And in John's gospel, we see Jesus and his disciples going to Jerusalem back and forth as though it's the hub, and especially to some of the festivals. So chronologically, John extends Jesus' ministry to about 3 years. And John presents a very high view of Jesus, the Christ, as the Christ from the outset. So the Synoptic Gospels, you have this incremental revelation that, oh, wow, this is the Messiah. And in John's Gospel, he gives it to us right at the beginning as a sort of revelation as to who he is. So let's go to the slides here. This is the prologue, the marvelous passage from the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Comprehend, to overcome. I'm pronouncing logos as logos here. because it tends to be in the Christian context what theologians do. We don't really know how the Omicron was pronounced in Koine Greek, but the consensus seems to be short O. So he's got his mind. Notice the imagery here, light and dark. John has in mind here his Greek audiences with whom resonated the use of the term logos. Hellenistic refers to Greek culture from the death of Alexander the Great to around 31 BC at the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. So Hellenistic is around this time contemporary of Jesus, the culture of the time. And during this time, Greek culture really flourished. It's partly why the New Testament's written in Koine Greek. So the term logos, we know, means many things. It can mean word, it can mean argument, song. We learned last week that Aristotle calls Plato's dialogues logoi, which is the Greek plural. It has this dialogic connotation. And I think it fits really nicely with all the dialogue we get in the Gospel of John. A lot of back and forth. But it's not Hellenistic at the expense of the Hebrew. Because you remember, we read the creation story last week for the other course, Poetry in the Bible. God spoke and there was light. He creates verbally. The word is spoken, it goes out, creation happens. It's not like the other gods who use their hands or um, are um, father illegitimate children and then creation is born. It's something that's completely verbal. And that's speaking into the Hebrew thing. So the Hebrew readers would have thought, okay, God spoke and everything came into being. But that word that was spoken is what shaped everything into being. And the Greek readers would hear logos and say, that's the word that was spoken. And so it perfectly marriages the Hebrew and Hellenistic and Greek sources here. The word made flesh. What's important here is that by using the term logos, John links Jesus as the incarnational logos, the creative word, to Greek philosophical traditions and theological frameworks. It's incredibly cosmopolitan. And so some of you in the community were in the chat, we're talking about John's use of the word logos, wondering what scholars had to say about it. I consulted the Oxford Handbook to Johannine Studies. Johannine Studies has to do with the books written by John. So that's the Gospel of John, the three letters, and Revelation. And basically, people have really debated the origins and meanings of Logos in John's Gospel. Some interpretations range from Jewish wisdom traditions, saying that John is drawing on those. Others say Greek philosophical influences. Rudolf Bultmann argued that John's Logos theology reflected a Hellenistic philosophy. C.H. Dodd said that, well, he's not influenced by that. He's just speaking their language. He's speaking Christian truths in a Hellenized vocabulary. And the conversation has kind of gone on around this, saying to what extent is he drawing on, to what extent is he utilizing a vocabulary. But what seems essential to me is that John is not plagiarizing Greek philosophy, but he seems to be borrowing it from a certain vocabulary that was already in place to convey the Christian truth about specifically the person of Christ, the Logos. And the gospel does this through the use of imagery too. The metaphor is optical. One might say even visionary. In him was life, and his life was the light of men. And the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehends it, doesn't overcome it. It's interesting too that comprehension, we tend to think of understanding, and there's that I think going on as well too. With those last two verses, we can't help but think of our readings from last week with Plato's allegory, the light and shadow. It reminds us of the liberated philosopher who descends from the land of light to bring light to the world of shadows, but the people in the shadows don't get it. In fact, they're quite hostile to this knowledge. What's implied by this comparison that is so delicate in its sophistication that we often miss it is that the incarnate Logos, the Christ, is cast into the role of Greek philosopher very subtly. It responds to the Greek idea of the liberating philosopher as though it were a shadow or type of the true liberating philosopher of Christ himself, not one who brings logos or reason, but one who is the true logos. While the other three gospels, the synoptics, are mainly concerned with showing how Jesus is the fulfillment of Hebrew poetry and prophecy, John's gospel also wants to show how Jesus is not only the fulfillment of Hebrew scripture, but the consummation of Hellenistic philosophical traditions too. I find that so fascinating. So some of you were wondering too in the chat, in the conversations, who was the Logos before he was Jesus Christ? And according to Christian tradition, the Logos is the Word, the begotten Son, the second member of the Trinity that existed before creation. So when the Son took on humanity, that's when he became Jesus Christ, which is interesting because um, that's why Milton, in that wonderful book in Paradise Lost, in the creation of the world is recounted by Raphael. The Son is the one to go down in the chariot to do the creating because he's the word that goes out from the mouth. So John wrote, he tells us this in the gospel. He wrote that people might believe, his readers would believe. And it has this evangelistic mission, which is, it is historical, it is documentary, but it's also, he does this not by relating facts, but through this exercise of the mind. John is interested in education in a broader sense of encountering reality, and the literary features he uses in the book do that. And one way is this reoccurring motif, which you might have mentioned. It's a little humorous, or which you might have noticed. It's a little humorous. It's called the misunderstanding motif. And this is a distinct feature of John. So Jesus is speaking, and people don't get it. And some of it's sometimes really funny. Other times it's not. So one example, one of the early examples of this was the temple of his body. So in John chapter 2, Jesus is talking to the people around the temple, and he says, destroy this temple. And he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, 40 and 6 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? And then the narrator says, but he spake of the temple of his body. So, oh, right, not literal, but figurative. And that shift happens over and over again to the readers of this book. The next, you have this conversation with Nicodemus, the rabbi. And Jesus answered and said unto him, verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus saith unto him, how can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter the second time into his mother's womb and be born? Jesus answered, verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, but that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Ah, okay. Thankfully, it's figurative. Of course, it's got a spiritual meaning here. Okay. That's the first misunderstanding. There's another one. The woman at the well. Jesus answered and said to her, whosoever drinks of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water, springing up to eternal life. And the woman said unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. So again, she's thinking literally. But the woman at the well is incredibly sharp. She gets it in the end in a way that we don't always see the disciples or the men do. It's interesting. The men interlocutors are particularly clueless sometimes, and we'll come back to that. Another misunderstanding. The disciples bring lunch. In the meanwhile, his disciples uh, prayed him, excuse me for that typo, prayed him, saying, Master, eat. But he said to them, I have meat to eat that ye know not of. Therefore said the disciples to one another, Hath any man brought him aught to eat? And Jesus said, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. So again, the dialogue provides the correct reading. Uh, one spiritual truth, a mistaken for literal, and then corrected with the spiritual. Another one is the bread of life discourse. And Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. They sound like the woman at the well. Give us this water so we won't be thirsty. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. It is the Spirit that quickeneth. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you, they are spirit, and they are life. The emphasis on spirit here harkens back to the misunderstanding with Nicodemus. No, I'm not talking physical, I'm talking spiritual. I'm not talking literal, I'm talking figurative. Um, and there are different ways to understand this. If you happen to be Roman Catholic and you believe in the doctrine of transubstantiation, then you would understand this slightly differently to say, oh, it means not purely spiritual, but the fulfillment which is to come in the Lord's Supper. I know a very good commentary on the New Testament by a Jesuit priest who omits this passage when he's talking about the misunderstanding motif, which is interesting. I don't think it does violence to the theology. Depends on how you read it, but I just throw that out there. Jesus' departure. He tells them he's going to die. I shall be with you a little while longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and not find me, and where I am you cannot come. And then the Jews said unto themselves, among themselves, where does he intend to go that we shall not find him? He's speaking of his death. Couple more. The nature of freedom. Jesus says, if ye continue in my word, then you are my disciples indeed, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And they answered him, we be of Abraham's seed, and we're never in bondage to any man. Hey, how sayest thou, ye shall be made free? And of course, he's talking of spiritual freedom. And then the last one, also drawing on Jewish history here in the scriptures. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and was glad. Then said the Jews unto him, Thou art not yet 50 years old. Hast thou seen Abraham? And Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Which is a statement of his divinity as well, which brings us to the next part, which is the I am statements. But let's stop here and consider this misunderstanding motif, because the analogical function in the brain is grounds for our idea and exploration of enchantment. These stories, with their relentless mistakes and corrections of literal thinking, require the reader to undergo the same instruction as the figures who don't understand, inculcating a certain way of interpreting the rest of the book. Just as the prisoner in Plato's cave thought that the shadows were the objects, and then he realized that no, the shadows were carved out of the reflected light, and that the objects were the objects, not the shadows objects. And then you learn that the reflection on the wall is not the light source, but light from the fire. Then, oh wait, the fire is not the one light, the sun is. And so you have that same function being exercised in this book. Two different ends, to be sure. But it's this incremental dilation of perception through these instances of misunderstanding. Now let's move to the I am statements, which is another feature of this book. There are 7 of them. And this also makes John's gospel different from the synoptic gospels, because there really are no parables. Jesus' discourse relies primarily on metaphors, and these metaphors are instances of self-identification. So one of them was, I am the bread of life. We heard that. And this Greek phrase, ego eimi, is often made much of because it's translated I am. It's an emphatic declaration, which connects it back to Yahweh's disclosure to Moses at the burning bush. When God says, when Moses says, what will I tell them? Who are you? And he says, I am that I am. The same thing's going on here. There are other ego eimi statements in John that don't relate to divinity. But these seem particularly to draw connection to the God of the Hebrews as incarnate in Christ. So there's the I am the bread of life. It's a metaphor. I am the light of the world. I am the door, specifically the sheep door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. Um, so instead of the parabolic style, we get the metaphorical uh, style here. Now, I'd like to consider, as we're shifting towards the latter part of the gospel, you have the signs, the miracles, the misunderstandings, and then it shifts where he's preparing to die. And he has the beautiful prayer to the Father and the last little sermon he gives his disciples, and then the crucifixion, the trial, and then the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection, and what happens after, before the ascension. But I'd like to consider how Jesus is presented in this gospel as really embodying both masculine and feminine ideals. And this conversation goes back centuries. There's a lot of interest now in gender and certain gendered aspects of spirituality and literature. But this is something that goes way back in the medieval period and also earlier in the early church. So some scholars, a lot of scholars, well, pretty much all scholars, I will say, see Jesus as masculine and feminine, as certain reflecting these ideals. One of the ways you have the masculine presentation of Jesus is that he embodies the Greco-Roman masculinity ideal of self-mastery and control. So you've got that on one hand, and on the other hand, you have some feminine representations where the discussion extends to symbolic language like childbirth, divine begetting, nuptial imagery, which constitute this complexity here. And if you think about it, if he's the perfect image, and male and female, he made them in his image, as Genesis says, then this really is not surprising. But how does the masculine Jesus come through? Partly in control of his fate, even at his crucifixion, he says in John 10, he lays down his life of his own accord, which really aligns with the Greco-Roman ideals of like a strong, autonomous man. And many warrior cultures have been drawn to this aspect of Jesus. The Old English poet in The Dream of the Rood will imagine Christ as a great Anglo-Saxon chieftain like Beowulf who lays down his life for the tribe. That's part of that imagination as well. The Greeks and Hebrews would have understood Jesus' authority through the patriarchal family model, of course. He is the son in relation to the father. There's this hierarchical male lineage that resonates with the Greco-Roman notions of paternal authority. And then there's more feminine aspects too, regarding womanhood and motherhood, actually. And we get this in the Synoptic Gospels when Jesus is a beautiful scene where he's on the hill overlooking Jerusalem. He's about to descend into Jerusalem. And he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, would that I had, uh, how have I longed to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks." Kind of maternal imagery there. And we see some of that happening in Jewish poetry and prophecy. So it's not really that surprising. But then, especially when you get to the crucifixion, it introduces this femininity. In John 19, you have the Roman soldier pierce Jesus' side. Symbolically, it's a kind of penetration that the Greco-Roman context would have seen as feminizing. But but John's is the only account that mentions the spear, which is interesting. And then what happens when his body is pierced? By the way, the body is already dead at this point. What happens when it's stabbed? There's a flow of blood and water. And many have likened this to a woman's water breaking before childbirth, the theme of being born again in John 3, the flow of blood and water from Jesus' side in John 19 have been interpreted as evoking childbirth imagery, placing Jesus as the mother of the church. This is something I heard even in from Southern Baptist pulpits, which are quite conservative traditionally, that um, this is the birth of the church. So there's this yonic imagery associated with the wound. And even in some medieval devotional practices, you have that aspect as well. So there are a couple. I went down this rabbit hole and found some interesting material. Um, Scholars on women in John's Gospel. Here are three, and what I'm about to tell you, I learned from these three sources. Dr. Alicia Myers, she's written on womanhood and motherhood in this Gospel. Joanne Brandt and Jocelyn McWhirter. Really, really useful sources, I thought. And one of the things I learned is that, and Joanne Brandt mentions this, is that there are similarities in the fourth gospel to Greek romance stories, which were popular around this time. So the texts, these stories often feature love, separation, a moment of recognition by the lover, and then reunion, usually between a heroic male protagonist and a female character. So, for instance, in a lot of Greek romances, the hero meets his future bride at a well. This is a traditional betrothal scene in both Greek and Jewish traditions. You have that in the book of Genesis. But that scene of Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well mirrors this pattern. Some scholars have said that the dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman plays into these romantic tropes. And it's not like they're not saying that, oh, Jesus is engaging in kind of a romantic dialogue with this woman. It's not a typical courtship scene. It transforms this literary precedent into a theological conversation. So they would have recognized a potential courting scene, even though that's certainly not what's implied. But that imagery is there. There's also the imagery of Jesus as the bridegroom. You know, John the Baptist in chapter 3 says Jesus is the bridegroom, which really enforces this nuptial scene. And you have that beautiful scene at the wedding of Cana, the first miracle recorded by John, where Jesus is in the role of, at this point, a wedding guest, but kind of like the bridegrooms of Greek romances who provides wine and secures a happy ending. So again, he's using the literary fabric of his day to call attention to certain aspects of Jesus' ministry on earth. And this is really not surprising since Christians since the first century have been reading the Hebrew erotic poem, the Song of Solomon. It's a love poem. It's erotic. It's beautiful. It's in the Bible. It's in the Christian Bible. The Christians read it as a metaphor for Christ's love for his church. So not only do you have this motherhood relationship with Christ and the church, but you also have this bridal, nuptial relationship with the church. And the metaphors are simply that. They're metaphors. And depending on where you place the inflection, you get a different mode of relating to Jesus. And I think that's what's furnished devotion across the centuries, is this complexity about the dynamic of Jesus as a man and Jesus as a human. So I found that interesting, and it's going to be important for when we come to Julian of Norwich. So hang on to that. So the scene of resurrection. Let's go to that. Mary Magdalene at the tomb in chapter 20. Magdalene's the first to recognize, and again, recognition is important for the Greek Romance tradition as well. So that's in here as well. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing, and knew not that it was Jesus. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said unto him, Sir, if thou have borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus said unto her, Mary. She turned herself and said unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Masters. You get this moment of recognition. She's the first to recognize the resurrected Christ. And then he says to her, Touch me not, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father. Which is interesting. But what I think is relevant here is the way women are figured in the Gospel of John are usually those who get it. It's the Samaritan at the well who recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah and becomes the first evangelist and missionary to her fellow Samaritans. Martha responds to Jesus with one of the clearest confessions of his identity in John 11. She says, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world, which is significant because this parallels Peter's famous confession in the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew 16, Peter says, Lord, I know that you are the Christ. But John centers this moment of on the theological insight of Martha. Again, you have the figure of Mary of Bethany in chapter 12. She comes in to anoint Jesus' feet, and this is usually an act of preparation for burial. She seems to understand that Jesus' mission is to die long before the disciples grasp that. And it takes them, even after Jesus' death, to realize that that was the mission the whole time. So there's some visionary faculty that the women are first to possess. And they understand on a level that the disciples don't. And that's something that really comes into the foreground with John's Gospel. Just to mention this, touch me not, this prohibition, has always been intriguing to me. I looked into it. Scholars don't agree on what to make of it. It seems likely that Jesus is telling Mary, don't cling to me because I'm going to have to go away. Don't keep me here. Don't try to keep me here. Mary wanted to grasp him and to keep him with her. But Jesus is preparing to leave again. This introduces a change to the relationship. Jesus might be telling Mary that their relationship must change and that he will no longer be physically present. I don't think it's a prohibition to touch his body because later in John 20, Thomas touches the wounds. Jesus actually invites him to do this, doubting Thomas, to try the wounds. It's really me, which suggests that it's not really prohibition against physical contact, but rather probably Mary's desire to keep him, to hold him longer. And pay attention to this, touch me not, because it's going to come up again in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale and in George MacDonald's Phantastes. But looking ahead to next week, we have to consider the ascension. So the death, the burial, the resurrection, and then he goes away. And the implications of the ascension are so radical. Eventually, Jesus ascends back to heaven. It's described at the end of the Synoptic Gospels, but the remarkable thing is that The Logos returns to heaven. The Son returns to heaven with the human body. That is, the body made of nature and humanity. That the human form was not something to be put on and then put off again after the mission was complete, but it's something to return with. And so I think for the purposes of this course, you should try to imagine the implications of this. That, okay, if this is true, this is the reality, how does that influence the imagination of so many authors who lived under this reality? That the Logos returns with the human body of Jesus back to heaven. And the idea that the material world, nature herself in human flesh, is being worn by the second person of the Trinity would really impact the way you viewed nature. The idea certainly had an impact on the theologies of the early church fathers and scholastics, and one important theologian to trace this idea is Maximus the Confessor, who would take this idea further, and from whom Johannes Scotus Origino would learn. This involves what we might call enchanted nature, nature teeming with what Maximus the Confessor called the logoi, the divine energies in nature that emanate from the logos. So Maximus the Confessor is a stepping stone to Origina, which we'll consider in our next week's lecture.